Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Paolo, and it's a pleasure to be with you and the group. I will mainly focus on migration, but I'm happy in the discussion also to discuss the future of globalization, development, and other topics that I'm passionate about. For me, the main emphasis of my interest in migration is because I believe that we are all migrants, all human beings, and it's migration which has created the very special situation that the human species is in. It's our ability to migrate that has defined us as humans. If we hadn't migrated, of course, we would be extinct because we would have died from natural catastrophes in Africa. We all have our roots back to common ancestry. And if you don't believe that, I encourage you to do some genomics. There are quite a few different genomic options, but in the front of my book, Exceptional People, I have my genome on my mother's side. In the back, inside cover, I have it on my father's side. They follow different routes, but over the last 150,000 years, they both go back to Africa. And that's true of all of us. So we are migrants by nature. We are migrants because it's the escaping of conflicts, of droughts, of catastrophes that allowed us to survive as a human species. And of course, it was that encounter with different environments in different places that led us to be such a sophisticated species. So migration isn't something which is an exception in that respect. It is what makes us human, our ability to migrate. Now, although many people believe that we are going through a period of mass migration, in terms of a share of the world's population, the numbers have been remarkably stable over time. And there have been periods in history, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, where migration was a much bigger share of the world's population. You'll be aware that a third of Ireland migrated, a third of Scandinavia migrated, a third of Italy migrated. These were very big mass migrations, mostly in the second half of the 19th century, driven by economics, driven by poverty, by the Irish famine, by the possibilities, but also facilitated by technology, particularly the steamship, which allowed much safer travel across the Atlantic and much more predictable, cheaper ability to move. So the combination of a push from conflicts, droughts, famines, natural catastrophes, and the means to travel in different ways has always been part of the story. Today, about 3.5% of the world's population, so approaching 300 million people in the world, are migrants. By migrants, I have a very particular definition, which is people that travel across national borders for a sustained period of time, either for economic reasons, family reunification reasons, extended students, economic migrants. Now, refugees are a subgroup of migrants, but I'd like to distinguish strongly between refugees and migrants, particularly because I believe the policy environment needs to be very, very different for refugees. Refugees have a legal definition. Refugees are subject to the UNHCR and other conventions. We have a moral and ethical, as well as a legal, responsibility to refugees. This is not true of other migrants generally. It is now, of course, back in the news with Ukraine and the fact that over 3 million Ukrainians, so well over 10% of the population, have become refugees to neighboring countries. But this has gone in waves. We saw with Syria, and we've seen in other waves in the past, the impulse of migration, driven by these conflicts or natural disasters. Of course, Afghanistan is going to be another big impulse for migration, for refugees. When it comes to migrants of other types, non-refugees, there are much more stable trends. Yes, droughts do push people to become economic migrants, but most people, 97% of the world's population, want to stay at home. People don't want to generally be migrants because it's a very, very risky thing to do. You leave your families, you leave your communities, you leave your loved ones, you go to a new place. Migrants tend to be self-selected as risk takers, as people that are prepared to make sacrifices in the hope of a better future. This is true of refugees as well, but refugees often have no option. If they stay behind, they die. And so they are propelled by an absolute need to become refugees. In the case of other forms of migration, economic migrants, family reunification, and so on, there's more choice involved. And so the people that tend to migrate tend to be often one member of a family, often the oldest male or the oldest female, working age, typically, and that means that their contributions and who migrants are is different. We've seen this over time. This was certainly the case in the 19th century as well, and in earlier periods of migration. And it defines who the migrants become later. Their demographics, where they come from, and their skills. Typically, the poorest people do not migrate because one needs some resources to migrate, to pay for an air flight, to pay for transport, to become knowledgeable about the options, and to survive during the journey. And so it tends to be the case that those on the absolute poverty line do not migrate very far. They might go to the closest town, they might go to somewhere nearby, but not cross national borders unless they are refugees. But economic migrants tend to be slightly better off and often more skilled, which gives them more option. We've increased the share of migrants in the population slightly from about 3 to 3.5%, but it's still a very, very small share. And my own view is that it's very unlikely to increase. Of course, if you define migration as crossing a national border, when you create a new country, you necessarily get a lot of migration. And so, for example, the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 90s led to very sharp increases in migration because people that thought they were all in one country suddenly moved across national borders to be in the country that they wanted to live in, a different country, because of the creation. Over 50 countries have been created over the last 50 years. And so with more borders and smaller countries and smaller countries, one should expect more migration. Of course, the European Union is a real exception because it has created the world's first big experiment in what it would be like in a world without borders. People often say, we need borders, we need passport controls. Well, of course, these are new inventions. Before the First World War, there were very few passports, and certainly in the 19th century, there were no passports. It's a modern invention of about the last 110 years that we have passports. And not only do we have passports, we have more and more countries. Over that period of time, we have about 100 more countries. And so it's not surprising that now we know who's moving, and people that used to just move and it was in the same country, now it's defined as a different country. And that in part explains the rise in perception of migration and in the numbers of migrants. So migration is a very old and is something which increasingly we become aware of because of not only the creation of passports, but harder and harder boundaries and borders, except in the European Union. Now, the European Union provides an experiment for us of what happens when you remove borders. As you know, in Portugal, anyone can travel anywhere in Europe if you're a European citizen. So the question is, why don't people travel more? Why is it that there are towns, like after the financial crisis in the early 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, where youth unemployment was 60% in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain? Why didn't more people leave these towns and go to where there were jobs in Germany, in Northern Europe, etc., in the UK, which then they were permitted to do? And the answer is that people don't leave unless they have an opportunity where they're going to. You don't want to become unemployed in Northern Europe. You'd rather stay near your family and friends where you are. And so the conclusion that some reach, that we're going to have mass migration because of big income differences, is not borne out by the evidence regarding what happens, particularly when incomes become very, very widely dispersed, as happened after the financial crisis. Unemployed people in a lot of Southern European countries losing income, and yet they didn't migrate unless they had opportunities. Skilled migration tends to be concentrated in a relatively small set of countries, and particularly in the OECD countries, in Europe, in the US, and elsewhere. About 20% of the countries that host migrants have a very high share. So about a fifth have very high shares of skilled. And the US is one of them. But of course, the US has a lot of unskilled migrants too. And skilled migrants are particularly concentrated in urban areas, more unskilled in rural areas, not least in agriculture. And it's the urban areas that, of course, are the dynamic hotspots of economies. It's very important to recognize that migrants are more productive than the native populations. Migrants, partly because as a whole, they tend to be of working age population, employed, not unemployed, and because they tend to be the more innovative members of their societies, tend to, on average, have higher levels of productivity. They are also particularly creative and innovative in different ways. If you look at the patent data, for example, which I've done with my colleagues, you see that migrants are very highly overrepresented in innovation. They are very highly, they double the probability of starting small businesses. And if you look at Nobel Prize winners or Academy Award winners and other citations of people that do particularly well in the arts or in the sciences, migrants are, of course, also highly overrepresented, much more likely to get a Nobel Prize. And this is very important because it's the nature of migration, but because they concentrate in cities as well, where they are more like-minded people, where they are able to fit in, where they have networks, they also contribute to the vibrancy of cities. Cities become more and more attractive and more dynamic, and this creates a positive virtual circle. It is no accident that the most dynamic cities in the world also have very high shares of migration, like 30% in London, for example, 30% in San Francisco. It's also the case that the cities that are voted to be in the Economist magazine's vote on which cities do people most want to live in, the cities that are the most popular, like Vancouver, like Toronto, like Melbourne, have the highest share of migrants, well over 50% in the case, for example, of Vancouver and Toronto. Very high share of non-native born people. So migrants are particularly innovative, creative, and create a dynamic within a society, which becomes a growth dynamic, which becomes the focus of dynamism. And this relates to the point about whether migrants undermine or not local wages. There is literature, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you study migration, which suggests that there's some small negative effect of migration on wages. I do not believe this literature. Firstly, there's much other literature which contradicts it. But secondly, it's comparative static. It's static. It's comparing over a single snapshot of time, but it's not doing what I believe is essential, which is a dynamic medium-term or long-term analysis. Why is that important? Because we know that the presence of migrants leads to higher growth rates. And as economies grow, employment grows. So simply saying the migrants come in and take some jobs, or that they reduce wages because there's competition and more labor supply, fails to examine the demand side, and particularly the growth of the demand side over time. And we've done analysis of that. And if you look at the report on the Oxford Martin website, which is a free PDF download called Migration and the Economy, which we did jointly with Citibank, you'll see a lot of data on this. So migrants contribute and over time raise the wages of economies. It's no accident that dynamic economies like the US have very high migrant shares in the most dynamic sectors like Silicon Valley. In fact, it's very difficult to think of an iconic Silicon Valley firm that is not migrant founded. And of course, Elon Musk, who went to the same high school as me in South Africa, is just one more example of this, but there are many, many of that. Over time, migration is also going to be vital in addressing demographic headwinds. What does this mean? The fertility rates of the advanced economies is declining rapidly, not least Portugal, Spain, but many, many others. Way below replacement rates, many less young people being born and older people living much longer. It is estimated that in Europe, the workforce as a result of this will be about a third smaller by 2050. In China, there are 4 million less workers this year than last year. So the question is, who's going to be doing the work in the future? And particularly, who's going to be looking after elderly people? Care work, which is very labor intensive, not well paid, not very pleasant always. And of course, how is this going to add up in terms of taxes and pensions and contributions? Well, migration is going to have to become more and more important. In fact, I believe that much of the ideology we have today, where we're trying to reduce the number of migrants, is going to seem very strange in 10 or 20 years' time, when the battle will be to attract migrants. We will want more, not less, of working age, of workers, to do the jobs which are very labor intensive, like labor intensive agriculture jobs, which cannot be automated, and jobs like childcare, like cooking, like looking after the elderly and nursing, which cannot be automated easily. Automation will do more and more jobs, but these are the repetitive jobs in services or in manufacturing. I believe that will increasingly be done digitally and automated. So when we think about migrants, we need to turn away from a fear of migrants to understanding that our future depends on them economically and in other ways for the dynamism and innovation of our societies to be sustained. When we look at the analysis of this, we show in this report, Migration and the Economy, that the control of migrants in the UK, for example, is severely undermining GDP. We also argue that it's reducing tax revenues. Now, there's a big debate as to whether migrants pay tax in a greater share than they take out. But because migrants tend to be working age, it's important to understand that they do not have the same level of need for schooling, for early health, for childbirth, etc., or for later health. And often their pensions are not given to them because they've left the countries. And this means that the expenditure on migrants tends to be much lower than for domestic populations. And the revenue can be similar if they are paying income tax based on their incomes, but also, of course, they pay value-added taxes and other taxes. This is amongst the many reasons why migrants need to be regularized. They need to be part of the system. They need to be registered. They need to have the rights and responsibilities of domestic people, including the responsibility of paying tax, of being law-abiding, and following whatever the norms and laws are of the country that hosts them. But the country also has a responsibility to them. And that comes with this, to treat them fairly, to make them subject to the health and safety and other laws, and to give them opportunities to participate in various levels, including, of course, benefiting from health and education. So the net analysis tends to show that migrants are not a burden economically on society, but have a very positive impact, particularly if one adopts a dynamic medium-term outlook. Of course, politicians are not medium-term, politicians are short-term, and increasingly want to blame foreigners and outsiders and others for their troubles. Many of the people that do so are themselves migrants of second or third generation. But this is a very old game of blaming foreigners. It's one that has led to genocide in Europe, in the Holocaust, and genocide against Roma people, for example. And we see it being the cause of conflict time and time again. We need to guard against it at all costs. We need to understand that there's no pure blood, that everyone is a mix of people from different places, and that enriches us rather than diminishes our status. We need to also be very clear in distinguishing between economic migrants and refugees. My own view is that all societies have a democratic right, if they're in a democracy, to choose who enters their society on a voluntary basis. And that needs to be informed by a proper, deep understanding of the costs and benefits, the historical responsibilities, and other considerations regarding this. My own view is that we should have many more migrants, but a bargain, a compact with migrants, in which we accept more people, but on condition that we are clear on the rights and responsibilities. The responsibility to abide by the law, to pay tax, and the right to benefit from social security, from education, health, and fair treatment, as well as minimum wages, health and safety legislation, etc. That's for economic migrants. A very different calculus needs to be adopted for refugees. There, I believe we have a legal responsibility. It should not be due to an accident of history that people find themselves stuck in Lampedusa or Lesbos in Greece or in Poland because they're next to Ukraine. Burden sharing is vital, and my country, the UK, has been shockingly bad in this, as have many. We need to accept that we have a common responsibility to refugees, legal, ethical obligation. You might have seen that the Home Office Secretary responsible for this in the UK has suggested sending refugees to Rwanda that arrive on British shores. In my view, this is a terrible idea, which is also illegal. We have a legal responsibility to accept people that arrive on our shores that are legitimate refugees, and until we can process them and ascertain whether they are refugees or not, we need to keep them in our shore. That's our legal responsibility. If we decide that they do not qualify as refugees, we also have a legal responsibility to return them to their country that they've come from. Sending them to a third country which have no association with is, in my view, an outrageous idea. So we need to be clear about this. And Europe, of course, and Portugal in the south of Europe near to Africa, as well, is very significantly placed in this, that the burden needs to be shared equitably. Germany has played a remarkable role in accepting over 1 million refugees from Syria. It was very politically risky for Angela Merkel. But what is remarkable is now the German economy is stronger for it. It has been a net positive for Germany, not least because of the demographics of Germany and the rapid decline in the working age population. It's interesting to see that Poland has accepted over 1 million Ukrainian refugees. Poland has been one of the most anti-migrant societies in Europe. Prior to the Ukraine crisis, less than 1% of the population was migrants, one of the lowest in Europe, and the same is true of Hungary. This is very different now. And the question is, what accounts for this difference? Why has Poland gone from being the least accepting of Europe to now the most accepting? Is it because these people look a bit like them, are culturally similar? They turned away the Syrians, who they regarded as being of a different religion, perhaps language, other differences, and now they accept the Poles. Or something more fundamentally changed in their understanding of the needs of refugees? Is this permanent or temporary? Whatever it is, I think we recognize that migration and refugees are here to stay. We need to develop a more sophisticated understanding, and we need to ensure that we balance the needs of our citizens with those of people from around the world. I'm a refugee. I would not be alive if both on my father and my mother's side countries had accepted. But many people were turned away, and many of my family were killed because they were not accepted. I became a refugee again when I left apartheid South Africa for the UK, and I went back, which illustrates something else of the circular nature of migrants and how one can contribute and go back when circumstances improved, as they did in South Africa after President Mandela became president. So these things can change over time, and hopefully Ukraine will become a country where it's safe for people to go back to, and people will go back when that is the case. But until that happens, we need to accept that we have a common responsibility to them. Part of the big challenge with migration and refugees is the narrative, is the media, is the politics, and how one tells the story. And that's why evidence is important. That's why it's important to recognize that there needs to be an evidence-based analysis, that more people should study it, and that it becomes a bigger focus. It is so important, and yet it is so neglected in academia, in policy discussions, and in the global governance system. There are massive holes in the global governance system, for example, on the portability of professional qualifications and of pensions. Much more needs to be done, and I'm delighted to be able to have a discussion with you all, to listen to your questions and concerns, and hopefully to advance this. Thank you.